Emily Carter ran her fingers through Shadow's golden fur, feeling the warmth of his body pressed against her. The rhythmic sound of his breathing always calmed her, no matter how chaotic her day had been. As a veterinarian, she spent her days surrounded by animals. But Shadow was different. He wasn't just another patient or a pet, he was family. The flickering light of the television cast a soft glow over the living room, as she leaned against Ryan Miller, her fiancé. His strong arm was wrapped around her shoulders, and for a moment everything felt perfect. But then, as if sensing something amiss, Shadow lifted his head from the floor and stared at Ryan. "What's with your dog?" Ryan muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Emily sighed, rubbing Shadow's ear. "He's just being protective." Ryan shook his head, exhaling sharply. "He's always watching me like that. It's creepy." Emily tried to brush off his words, but a small knot formed in her stomach. She had noticed Shadow's behavior too, how he always seemed uneasy around Ryan lately, how he would sit by the couch and stare at him with an intensity that felt almost human. Ryan adjusted his position, pulling Emily closer. "Maybe you should train him to, I don't know, relax. I mean, it's not like I'm a stranger." Shadow suddenly let out a low growl, not loud, not aggressive, just a warning, a sound that sent a chill down Emily's spine. Ryan stiffened. "Okay, that's it." He stood abruptly, pushing Emily aside as he shot a glare at Shadow. "That mutt is out of control." Emily's heart clenched as she moved between them, her hands raised defensively. "Ryan, stop. He's not doing anything wrong." Ryan's face twisted in frustration. "Emily, I've been patient. I put up with the fur, the barking, the mess. But this is too much. Either you train him, or he stays outside whenever I'm here." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The idea of keeping Shadow outside, away from her, felt like a betrayal. "Ryan, he's family." Ryan scoffed. "No, he's a dog." Shadow let out another soft growl, his gaze never leaving Ryan. "See?" Ryan gestured at Shadow, his voice rising. "Even now he's challenging me." Emily turned to Shadow, kneeling in front of him. "Hey buddy, it's okay," she whispered, stroking his head. Shadow whined softly, pressing his nose against her palm. He seemed anxious, like he was trying to tell her something. Ryan ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. "Emily, I love you, but I won't spend the rest of my life walking on eggshells around a jealous dog." Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "He's not jealous, Ryan. He's trying to protect me." Ryan threw up his hands. "From what? Me? That's ridiculous." A tense silence filled the room. The weight of Ryan's ultimatum hung heavy in the air. Emily glanced down at Shadow, his warm brown eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Love? Fear? A warning? She took a deep breath. "I need time to think." Ryan exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "Fine, but I'm telling you now, Emily, this won't work if he's always coming between us." With that, he grabbed his jacket and walked toward the door. Shadow stood up instantly, his ears perked, his body tense. Ryan glanced back, shaking his head. "You need to choose." The door slammed shut. Emily closed her eyes, feeling Shadow nuzzle against her leg. She reached down, gripping his fur tightly. She had never doubted her love for Ryan before, but tonight, as Shadow's quiet whimper filled the empty room, doubt seeped into her heart. The house felt emptier without Ryan's presence, but Emily couldn't shake the unease lingering in the air. She sat on the couch, running her hands over Shadow's soft fur, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She loved Ryan, truly, but his words kept echoing in her head. "You need to choose," she exhaled slowly. "What am I supposed to do, Shadow?" she murmured. Shadow let out a soft whimper, pressing his head into her lap. It was as if he understood everything, as if he was just as conflicted as she was. The next few days passed in a blur of avoidance. Ryan sent a few texts, but Emily wasn't ready to respond. She needed time to sort out her feelings. Meanwhile, Shadow's strange behavior only intensified. He wouldn't leave her side. Every step she took, he was there, tail low, eyes alert. When she was in the kitchen, he sat by her feet. When she showered, he lay just outside the door. When she slept, he curled up at the foot of her bed, his ears twitching at every noise. And then there were the nights. The scratching started the first night Ryan was gone. At first, she thought it was just the wind rattling the window, but then she heard it again, sharp, insistent scratching against the bedroom door. She bolted upright, her pulse pounding. Shadow stood by the door, his body rigid, a deep growl rumbling from his throat. Emily hesitated before climbing out of bed, her feet touching the cool hardwood floor. She opened the door just a crack and peeked into the hallway. Nothing, she sighed, rubbing her temples. Shadow, you're making me paranoid. But he didn't relax. His eyes stayed fixed on the hallway as if he was waiting for something. The next morning, Emily finally decided to call Ryan. He answered on the second ring. Hey. Emily hesitated. Hey. There was silence on the line before Ryan spoke again. So, have you thought about what I said? Emily sighed, glancing at Shadow who sat at her feet. His ears perked. I don't know, Ryan. I feel like you're asking me to choose between you and my best friend. Ryan exhaled loudly. Emily, I'm not trying to be the bad guy here. But Shadow's behavior is not normal. He growls at me. He stares at me like I'm a threat. You're a vet. Dogs don't just act like that for no reason. Emily frowned, her fingers tightening around the phone. I am a vet, Ryan. And that's why I know dogs don't just hate people for no reason either. Ryan was quiet for a moment. So, what are you saying? I'm saying, maybe Shadow is sensing something we're not. Ryan scoffed. Emily, come on. I'm serious, she said. He's been acting strange, pacing, whining. He wouldn't even let me sleep last night. He just sat by the door like he was guarding me. Ryan sighed. Maybe he's just picking up on your stress. Dogs do that. Emily shook her head. No, it's more than that. Ryan's voice softened. Look, I get that you love him, but if we're going to build a future together, we need to find a solution. I don't want to fight about this. Emily rubbed her forehead. Neither do I. So, can we try something? Ryan asked. Just for a few days. Have him stay somewhere else, maybe with your parents. Just to see if things change. Emily's stomach twisted at the thought of being separated from Shadow, but a part of her knew Ryan wasn't wrong. Maybe she needed to step back and look at this objectively. Fine, she finally said. But just for a couple of days. Ryan's voice softened. Thank you. I love you, Em. I love you too, she murmured. But the words felt heavy in her throat. She hung up and looked down at Shadow. He stared back at her, as if he knew what was coming. Emily couldn't shake the feeling of guilt as she packed Shadow's things. A few of his favorite toys, his leash, and a blanket he always curled up with. Every time she glanced at him, he sat near the door, ears drooping, his amber eyes following her every move. He knew. He might not understand why, but he knew something was about to change. When she finally kneeled beside him, he pressed his head against her chest, his body warm against hers. It's just for a little while, buddy, she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as him. The drive to her parents' house was silent. Shadow sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his posture tense. He usually loved car rides, sticking his head out to feel the wind, but today he just watched, as if memorizing the path, knowing he might need to find his way back. When they arrived, her mom greeted them at the door with a bright smile. Oh, my favorite granddog. Come here, sweet boy. Shadow gave her mom a reluctant tail wag, but stayed pressed against Emily's leg. He didn't want to go inside. Emily bent down, running her hands through his fur. It's just a few days, okay? She murmured, though her heart clenched at the sadness in his eyes. She felt like she was betraying him. Her dad stepped up beside her, arms crossed. You sure about this, Em? Shadow's been with you through everything. Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. I just need to figure some things out with Ryan. Her dad sighed. I don't know why you're trying to make this work with a guy who doesn't like your dog, Dad. I'm just saying. He shrugged. A man who truly loves you should love all of you, including the dog that's been by your side longer than he has. Emily forced a smile. It's temporary. Her dad didn't look convinced. She gave Shadow one last hug, then turned toward her car. As she pulled out of the driveway, she saw Shadow standing in the doorway, staring at her. His tail didn't wag. He didn't move. He just watched her leave. The house felt wrong when she returned. No shadow waiting at the door. No familiar thumping of his tail against the floor. The silence pressed down on her, thick and unnatural. She tried to focus on work, but her mind kept drifting. Was Shadow okay? Was he eating? Did he think she abandoned him? When Ryan came over that evening, he pulled her into a kiss, but she barely responded. "What's wrong?" he asked. Emily hesitated. I miss Shadow." Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Emily, I know this is hard, but it's for the best. Maybe now we can actually relax without a dog jumping between us." She forced a smile. "Yeah, maybe." That night, the scratching started again. Emily sat bolt upright in bed, heart hammering. The sound was faint but unmistakable, scraping against the front door. For a second she thought it was Shadow, but then she remembered, Shadow wasn't here. She slowly got out of bed, creeping toward the door. Her fingers hesitated over the handle. Was it the wind? An animal? A chill crawled down her spine. She peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and cracked it open, the cool night air rushing in. The porch light flickered slightly, casting eerie shadows over the empty front yard. But then she noticed it. A single footprint in the dirt near the porch steps. Someone had been standing there, watching. Emily slammed the door shut, locking it quickly. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she backed away. Shadow knew. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Shadow had been acting this way for a reason. Not because he hated Ryan. Not because he was jealous. But because something was wrong. Emily grabbed her phone and dialed her mom's number. It rang twice before she picked up, her voice groggy with sleep. "Emily? What's wrong? Is Shadow okay?" Emily's voice was shaky. Her mom hesitated. I think so." "Why?" Emily's stomach twisted. "Can you check?" There was shuffling on the other end of the line. Then her mom's voice turned sharp. "Emily, he's gone." Emily's breath caught. "What?" "His leash is still here, but the backyard gate is wide open." A cold wave of fear crashed over Emily. Shadow had escaped, and she had a terrible feeling she knew exactly where he was going. Emily barely processed her mother's words before she was grabbing her keys and sprinting to her car. Her mind raced as she sped through the empty streets. Her hands clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that her knuckles turned white. Shadow had escaped. Not wandered off. Escaped. He'd never done that before. Not once. There was only one explanation. He was coming back to her. Or worse, he was running toward whatever danger he had sensed all along. Her stomach churned. Had she made a terrible mistake sending him away? Had Shadow been trying to warn her this entire time, and she had ignored him? As she pulled up to her house, her headlights illuminated the dark street, but the front yard was empty. She jumped out of the car, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "Shadow?" she called, her voice breaking the silence of the night. "Shadow? Where are you?" Nothing. Not a sound. The streetlights flickered slightly, casting long, distorted shadows across the sidewalk. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she turned in a slow circle. If Shadow wasn't here, then where? Ryan. A horrible realization sank into her bones. Shadow had gone to Ryan's apartment. She didn't know how she knew it. She just did. Fumbling with her phone, she dialed Ryan's number. It rang. Once. Twice. 5 times. No answer. Panic clawed up her throat. Without hesitation, she jumped back into her car and sped toward Ryan's place. As she pulled into his parking lot, dread twisted her stomach into knots. Something felt wrong. The lights in Ryan's apartment were off. His car was in the driveway, which meant he should be home. But there was no movement inside. No sign that he had just ignored her call. And then she saw it. A dark figure darting away from the side of Ryan's building. Her breath hitched. The person was dressed in all black, a hood covering their face. They moved quickly, disappearing into the shadows behind the complex. Emily's entire body went cold. What the hell was going on? She jumped out of the car, her mind screaming at her to call the police. But something else pulled her forward. Shadow. A desperate, familiar sound cut through the still night. A whimper. Emily turned toward Ryan's apartment door. Shadow was there, his paws scratching frantically against the wood, his fur bristled, his body tense. And then she saw the most terrifying thing of all: blood. Shadow's paws were smeared with it. Emily's chest tightened. Oh my God. Her hands trembled as she grabbed the doorknob. Locked. Of course it was locked. But Ryan wasn't answering his phone. Ryan wasn't answering at all. She pounded on the door. Ryan, open up. Nothing. Her heart raced. Something was wrong. She stepped back, took a deep breath, and with every ounce of strength she had, kicked the door near the handle. The first hit barely budged it. The second sent a sharp pain up her leg. The third, crack. The door flung open. And then she saw him. Ryan was lying on the floor, unconscious. His skin was pale, his lips tinged blue. There was a pool of blood near his head, and standing over him, nudging his chest frantically, was Shadow. Emily barely had time to process what she was seeing before she was at Ryan's side, pressing her fingers against his neck. A pulse. Faint. Too faint. Oh my God. Ryan, she whispered, grabbing his face. Ryan, wake up. Nothing. His chest rose and fell in weak, shallow movements. She pressed her hands to his cheek. His skin was ice cold. A sudden wave of dizziness crashed over her. Shadow had been trying to tell her. All this time he had known, and she had sent him away. Tears blurred her vision. Ryan, you need to wake up. Shadow let out a low whine and pressed his nose against Ryan's chest. Emily's brain kicked into survival mode. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. This is Emily Carter. I need an ambulance immediately. My fiancé. He's unconscious. There's blood. His breathing is weak. Please hurry. The dispatcher's voice was calm, asking for details, but Emily could barely focus. She clutched Ryan's hand. Hold on, okay? Help is coming. Shadow whined, nudging Ryan again as if trying to wake him up. Emily's hands shook violently. She had been so blind. All of Shadow's warnings, his strange behavior, his desperate attempts to get close to Ryan. It had never been about jealousy. Shadow had sensed this. And if he hadn't escaped, if he hadn't led her here tonight, Ryan would have died. The weight of that realization nearly crushed her. Then for the first time since she had met Ryan, she whispered something she never thought she'd say. Please don't leave us. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air, their wailing cries slicing through the suffocating silence in Ryan's apartment. Emily knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she kept pressure against his shoulder, trying to keep herself from breaking down. Shadow stood protectively by her side, his chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths, as if he too understood the severity of the moment. Ryan wasn't moving. His breathing was weak, and the realization that she had almost lost him crushed her like a weight too heavy to bear. Emily brushed a strand of hair from Ryan's damp forehead. Hold on, she whispered. Just a little longer. Shadow let out a soft whimper, nudging Ryan's arm with his nose. The dog's golden fur was streaked with blood, but it wasn't his. It was Ryan's. Emily's stomach twisted. Shadow had been trying to warn her this entire time, and she had ignored him. Her gaze flickered toward the doorway, where the shattered remains of the lock still clung to the frame. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine. The dark figure, the one she had seen running from the building. Had that person done this? Had someone tried to hurt Ryan? If Shadow hadn't been here, a horrible thought crossed her mind. Was this an accident at all? Before she could think any further, the front door burst open, and paramedics flooded into the room. A woman in navy scrubs dropped to her knees beside Emily, her hands moving swiftly as she checked Ryan's vitals. He's unresponsive but breathing, she said, her voice clipped and professional. She turned toward her partner. BP is dangerously low. We need to move him now. Emily felt frozen, watching as they worked on Ryan, hooking him up to oxygen, checking his pupils, securing him onto a stretcher. Every movement seemed surreal, like she was watching someone else's life fall apart instead of her own. She wanted to scream at them to do more, to tell them that Ryan wasn't just another patient, he was hers, but she could barely get the words past her throat. One of the paramedics turned to her. Are you coming with us? Emily blinked. Yes, of course, but her eyes flickered to Shadow. He had saved Ryan's life. He had fought to warn her, had run for miles to bring her back here, and now she was about to leave him behind. Shadow was her family too. The paramedic must have seen the hesitation on her face. "You can follow in your car," he said gently. "We'll take care of him." Emily sucked in a deep breath and nodded. "I'll be right behind you." With that, they carried Ryan outside, Shadow trotting anxiously behind them. He let out a soft growl when they placed Ryan into the ambulance, his protective instincts kicking in. But Emily knelt and cupped his face. "Hey," she murmured, forcing her voice to stay calm. "I need you to be good, okay? I need you to wait for me." Shadow whined, his eyes darting from Emily to the ambulance, as if he understood everything that was happening. She swallowed hard. "I'll bring him home." Shadow let out a small broken sound, one that almost sounded like he was begging her to keep that promise. Then the ambulance doors slammed shut, and Emily was left standing there, her heart pounding, her hands shaking, as the sirens carried Ryan away into the night. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Emily barely remembered how she got there, only that her hands had clenched around the steering wheel so tightly that her fingers ached. When she finally arrived, she ran through the emergency room doors, scanning the waiting area frantically. A nurse approached her. "Are you here for Ryan Miller?" Emily nodded quickly. "Yes." "Is he okay?" "Is he?" "He's in the ICU," the nurse interrupted, her expression carefully neutral. "He was severely anemic when he arrived. The doctors are running tests now." Emily's breath caught. "Anemic? But he's healthy," she said, her voice shaking. "He's a paramedic. He runs marathons. He doesn't just—" The nurse hesitated before answering. "His blood work suggests this has been building for some time." She sighed. "I know this is difficult, but the doctor will explain everything soon. In the meantime, I'll take you to the waiting area." Emily barely processed the words as she followed the nurse down the cold, sterile hallway. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Ryan was strong. Ryan was unstoppable. And yet, he had nearly died tonight, because she had ignored the one creature who had been trying to save him all along. Emily collapsed into a chair, her hands gripping her arms. Guilt crawled through her like a disease, tightening its grip with every second that passed. She had sent Shadow away. She had let Ryan convince her that the dog was the problem, when in reality, he had been the only one who knew the truth. Tears burned in her eyes. She didn't know how much time passed before the doctor finally walked into the waiting area. Emily shot up from her seat. "How is he?" The doctor, a tall man with graying hair, held a clipboard in his hands, his expression serious. "Ryan's stable for now," he said, "but his condition is serious. His blood count was dangerously low, and we believe he suffered an internal rupture." Emily's heart dropped. "An internal rupture? What? What caused it?" she whispered. The doctor adjusted his glasses. "We believe Ryan has early-stage leukemia." Emily's breath left her body. No, that wasn't possible. "He can't." She couldn't even say the words, but the doctor nodded solemnly. "It's a rare form, but his symptoms align with what we've seen in cases of undiagnosed leukemia. The good news is that we caught it early enough that treatment is possible." Emily felt the room start to spin. Her legs wobbled, and she sank back down into the chair. Ryan had cancer. Her strong, unstoppable, invincible Ryan had cancer, and Shadow had known. The dog had been trying to tell them all along. He had sensed it. He had tried to warn them. He had fought, screamed, clawed, and ran for miles to make sure Emily got to Ryan before it was too late. Emily pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to stop the sob that ripped from her chest. How many times had she scolded Shadow? How many times had she told him to stay away from Ryan, thinking he was just being difficult? She had almost lost both of them, and it was her fault. The doctor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He's going to need support," he said softly. "It's going to be a long road, but we caught it early. That's what matters." Emily nodded weakly, her entire body trembling. Ryan was still here. He was still breathing, and she would not fail him again. She wiped at her eyes, and stood up. "Can I see him?" she asked, her voice breaking. The doctor nodded, and led her down the hallway. As they approached Ryan's hospital room, Emily paused outside the door, and for the first time since arriving, She let out a long, shaky breath. Then she stepped inside, ready to fight for the man she loved. The quiet hum of the hospital room was broken only by the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor. Emily stood in the doorway, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Ryan lying there, pale against the stark white sheets. The tubes attached to his arms, the oxygen line running beneath his nose. It all felt like something out of a nightmare. Ryan, the man who had spent his life saving others, now needed saving himself. Her hands trembled as she stepped inside, her legs carrying her forward on instinct alone. "Ryan," she whispered. His eyes flickered open, sluggish and unfocused. For a brief moment, confusion crossed his face before his gaze finally settled on her. Emily forced a smile, but her voice wavered. "Hey." Ryan blinked slowly, his lips parting, but no words came. He looked exhausted, drained in a way Emily had never seen before. A weak attempt at a smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, but the effort seemed almost too much. Emily swallowed past the lump in her throat. "You scared me," she admitted, sinking into the chair beside his bed. "I thought." She stopped herself, shaking her head. "You're okay now, that's what matters." Ryan's fingers twitched slightly, and she reached out, threading her hand through his. His grip was weak, so much weaker than she ever thought possible. He licked his dry lips, trying to form words. She soothed. "Don't talk too much yet. Just rest." Ryan exhaled shakily, his eyes drifting closed for a moment. Then he whispered, "Shadow." Emily's throat tightened. Of course. Ryan had spent months resenting the dog, refusing to let him near. But now, after everything, Shadow was the first name on his lips. A fresh wave of guilt crashed over her. She shouldn't have sent Shadow away. She should have trusted him from the start. If she had, maybe she wouldn't be sitting here right now, watching Ryan fight for his life. Emily forced back the tears, threatening to spill, and ran a hand through Ryan's damp hair. "He saved you, Ryan. He tried to tell us, and we didn't listen." Ryan's brow furrowed slightly, his breath uneven. "Where?" "He's at home," Emily assured him, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'll bring him soon." Ryan's lips parted like he wanted to say something more, but his exhaustion pulled him under before he could. His breathing evened out, his fingers loosening slightly in her grasp. Emily sat there for a long time, just watching him sleep. She thought about all the nights she had held Shadow back, kept him away, convinced that Ryan was right, that he was just a problem. But Shadow had been fighting for them this entire time. She owed him everything. Emily took a deep breath and made a decision. She wasn't going to wait. She was bringing Shadow to Ryan now. The moment she stepped through the front door of her house, Shadow bolted toward her. He skidded to a stop in front of her, sniffing frantically, his body shaking with tension. Emily barely had time to crouch down before Shadow lunged into her arms, knocking her back slightly. His tail thumped wildly, but his whines told her everything she needed to know. He had been waiting for her. He had been waiting for Ryan. Emily buried her face in his fur, holding onto him tightly. "I'm so sorry, boy," she whispered. "I should have never doubted you." Shadow let out a soft huff, licking the side of her face as if to say, "I forgive you, just take me to him." Emily pulled back, cupping his face. "Do you want to see Ryan?" Shadow let out a sharp, eager bark. She smiled through her tears. "All right, let's go." Watch out. Hospitals weren't exactly dog-friendly, but Emily wasn't about to take no for an answer. She had made a call on the way, explained everything, how Shadow had saved Ryan, how he had been trying to warn them all along. Maybe it was the desperation in her voice, or maybe it was the fact that one of the nurses was an animal lover, but they had made an exception. Now, Shadow trotted beside her, tail wagging anxiously, as they approached Ryan's hospital room. The moment Emily opened the door, Shadow froze. Ryan was still asleep, his breathing steady but weak. Shadow let out the softest whimper. Emily knelt beside him, running a hand down his back. "Go on," she whispered. Shadow hesitated, his ears pressing back. Then he moved, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid he might hurt Ryan just by being near him. He placed his front paws up on the edge of the bed, his nose pressing against Ryan's arm. For a moment, there was nothing. Then Ryan's fingers twitched. Shadow let out a low, drawn-out whine, nosing Ryan's hand insistently. Emily's breath caught. "Ryan," she whispered. Ryan's eyelids fluttered. Then finally, they opened. It took a second for him to focus. But when his gaze landed on Shadow, something shifted in his face. "Hey buddy," Ryan rasped. Shadow let out a small, relieved bark, his tail wagging fiercely. Emily had never seen Shadow look so happy. Ryan's lips twitched upward, his fingers curling slightly. "You never gave up, huh?" His voice was barely there, but the emotion in it was undeniable. Emily swiped at her damp cheeks. "No," she whispered. "He never did." Ryan's gaze softened as he reached out, weakly running his fingers through Shadow's fur. And just like that, all the walls Ryan had built against Shadow crumbled. It was forgiveness. It was gratitude. It was the first step toward healing. Shadow stretched out beside Ryan, resting his head against Ryan's chest, as if to anchor him back to life. Ryan exhaled shakily, his grip on Shadow tightening just slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. Shadow didn't need words to answer. He just stayed. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan didn't push him away. Ryan hadn't fully processed everything yet. He was still weak, his body fighting against the exhaustion. But one thing was clear: Shadow had saved his life. The dog he had once resented was now curled up beside him, his head resting on Ryan's chest, as if he had never left his side. And maybe, in a way, he never had. Ryan's fingers twitched as he gently stroked Shadow's fur. He could feel the steady rise and fall of the dog's breathing, the warmth of his body, the quiet presence that had always been trying to protect him. Ryan swallowed hard. His throat felt tight. He had been so wrong. Emily sat quietly beside the bed, watching them with red-rimmed eyes. She hadn't said much, but she didn't need to. Ryan could see everything in her expression: the relief, the guilt, the overwhelming gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have to choose between them. They had chosen each other. Ryan exhaled slowly. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve him." Emily's brows furrowed. "Ryan, I don't," he said, his eyes never leaving Shadow. "I ignored him. I pushed him away. I thought he was just—" He stopped, shaking his head. "And he still saved me." Shadow let out a quiet huff, as if dismissing Ryan's guilt entirely. Ryan let out a weak chuckle, the sound strange even to himself. "Yeah, I guess you don't hold grudges, huh?" Shadow's tail gave the smallest thump against the mattress. Emily reached over and placed her hand over Ryan's. "He always knew," she murmured. "Before either of us did." Ryan swallowed past the lump in his throat, blinking rapidly against the burning in his eyes. He had never been a man who cried easily. He had faced chaos, emergencies, loss, all without shedding a tear. But now this moment, this dog, lying beside him, trusting him after everything, broke something inside him. Ryan exhaled shakily, blinking up at the ceiling. "Shadow's a good judge of character," Emily whispered, squeezing his hand gently. "He saw something in you, even when you didn't." Ryan let out a breathless laugh, but it sounded more like a choked sob. He turned his head slightly, looking at her with tired eyes. "He's got terrible taste then." Emily smiled softly, brushing her fingers against Shadow's fur. "No, he got it right." Ryan let the silence settle over them. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, he felt safe. The days that followed weren't easy. Ryan's diagnosis wasn't something he could outrun. It wasn't an injury that could be fixed with stitches and painkillers. It was something inside him, something his own body had turned against him. Leukemia. The word alone had felt like a death sentence. But he had caught it early, because of Shadow, because of the dog who wouldn't stop warning them. His treatment started almost immediately. At first it was just small changes, medications, adjustments, tests. But soon it turned into something heavier. Rounds of chemotherapy, weakness that wouldn't go away, days where standing felt impossible. And through all of it, Shadow never left his side. Ryan had never believed in things like fate, but he did now. He had to. Because without Shadow, he wouldn't have even known he was sick. The thought haunted him during the long, sleepless nights. He could still picture what would have happened if Emily had chosen differently, if she had pushed Shadow away completely, If she had listened to Ryan's stubborn hatred instead of trusting her best friend, Ryan might have died without even knowing why. That thought didn't leave him, and neither did Shadow. The dog followed him from room to room, always watching, always waiting. When Ryan was too weak to stand, Shadow rested against him. When he felt the nausea creeping in, Shadow pressed his cold nose against his hand. When he was too exhausted to form words, Shadow simply stayed. Ryan found himself reaching for him without thinking. It had once been an unwanted presence, something that irritated him to no end. But now Shadow's presence was the only thing keeping him grounded. One night the weight of it all became too much. Ryan sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, his body fighting him at every turn. His muscles ached, his chest felt too tight, like he was drowning in exhaustion. Emily had fallen asleep on the couch downstairs, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. She had spent so much time taking care of him, worrying for him. He didn't want her to see him like this, but Shadow did. The dog was watching. He always was. Ryan could feel him before he even looked up. The warm press of fur against his leg, the weight of his presence beside him. Ryan let out a shaky breath, lifting his head. Shadow tilted his head, studying him with those same unwavering, knowing eyes. Ryan's voice cracked. "I don't think I can do this." Shadow let out a soft whine. Ryan exhaled sharply, gritting his teeth. His throat burned, his vision blurring at the edges. "I don't," he repeated, his voice breaking. "I'm tired, buddy. I'm so." He stopped, shaking his head. Shadow didn't move, didn't push, didn't try to fix things. He just stayed. Ryan sucked in a shaky breath, rubbing a hand down his face. He felt the familiar pressure of Shadow's head against his knee, and for the first time in weeks, he let himself break. The tears came silently, but they came. Shadow didn't move away, didn't judge him. He just sat there, pressed against him, the same way he always had. Ryan leaned into him, and for the first time since this all began, he let himself be comforted. Emily found them like that in the morning. Ryan had fallen asleep sitting up, his head resting against the pillows. Shadow was curled up beside him, one paw draped over Ryan's leg, his ears flicking as Emily stepped inside. Her heart clenched. She walked over slowly, pressing a hand against Ryan's forehead, checking his temperature out of habit. He didn't stir, but Shadow did. His eyes flickered open, locking onto her immediately. She smiled softly, running a hand down his back. "You're amazing," she whispered. Shadow didn't respond, but he didn't need to. Emily sat beside the bed, watching the two souls she loved most in this world, finally at peace. The worst wasn't over. Not yet, but somehow, they were going to make it through, together. Ryan's world had changed. It wasn't just the diagnosis. It wasn't just the treatment. It was the way he saw everything now. Time moved differently. It wasn't rushed anymore. Every moment felt more important, more fragile, and through it all, Shadow remained at his side. Ryan had once thought of Shadow as a problem, a distraction, a dog that came between him and Emily. Now, Shadow was the only reason he was still here. Ryan wasn't sure how to repay that, but he wanted to. And he would. The next few weeks were a battle. Chemo had a way of breaking a person down. It wasn't just the exhaustion. It was the nausea, the dizziness, the way his body felt like it wasn't even his own anymore. There were good days and bad days. Shadow never left his side for either. When the treatments drained him, Shadow would curl up beside him, a silent protector. When the nausea hit, Shadow would press against him, grounding him. When the nightmares came, dark, suffocating, unshakable, Shadow would nudge him awake, soft and gentle, his warm breath against Ryan's skin. Ryan didn't know how he ever doubted him. Shadow had known before anyone. And now, Ryan was learning from him. Emily, and noticed the change. She didn't say anything at first. She just watched. She saw the way Ryan reached for Shadow now, without hesitation. The way his fingers curled into the dog's fur when the exhaustion hit. The way Shadow's presence calmed him in a way nothing else could. She saw how Ryan spoke to him now, how he trusted him in ways he never had before. And she saw how Shadow trusted him back. One night, After Ryan had finally drifted into sleep, Emily sat beside him, Shadow's head resting in her lap. Her fingers ran absently through his fur. As she whispered, "You knew, didn't you?" Shadow let out a slow breath, his eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. Emily smiled softly. "You saved him." The dog's tail thumped once against the bed. Emily exhaled, her throat tight. "I don't know what we would have done without you." Shadow didn't move, but his eyes remained on Ryan. Emily followed his gaze, watching the man she loved, the man she had almost lost. The worst was behind them, but Ryan's battle wasn't over yet. Emily. The next morning, Ryan woke to find Shadow watching him, not in an intrusive way, not in the way he once found irritating. Now, it was comforting. Ryan's throat was dry, his body still aching, but he managed a small, weak smile. "Morning, buddy." Shadow's ears perked. Ryan sat up slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. "You sleep at all?" Shadow huffed. Ryan chuckled. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Emily walked in a few moments later, a cup of tea in her hands. She paused in the doorway, watching the two of them. Her heart swelled. Ryan was still recovering, but the man sitting in front of her wasn't the same one from before. The man who once resented Shadow now leaned on him, and Shadow never let him fall. Emily. As Ryan grew stronger, so did their bond. The days stretched on, but Ryan's view of Shadow changed forever. He noticed things now. The way Shadow always positioned himself between Emily and the door. The way he watched Ryan carefully, taking in every movement. The way he could sense exhaustion before Ryan even felt it. Ryan had spent so much time pushing him away. Now, he wondered how he had ever lived without him. One afternoon, as Ryan sat on the couch, Emily beside him, Shadow at his feet, he finally said it. "I was wrong." Emily blinked. "What?" Ryan exhaled, his hand running over Shadow's fur. "About him." Shadow lifted his head slightly. Ryan swallowed. "I thought he was just a dog." He let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. "I thought he was getting in the way. Of us. Of everything." Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. Ryan looked down at Shadow, his voice quieter now. "I don't know if I'll ever deserve what you did for me." Shadow just watched him, those brown eyes filled with something Ryan would never be able to describe. Emily smiled softly. "He doesn't need you to deserve it." Ryan let the silence settle over them. Then, slowly he reached out, and scratched behind Shadow's ear. Shadow's tail wagged. Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess you were always on my side, huh?" Shadow leaned into his touch. Ryan felt something inside him ease. For the first time in months, he wasn't just surviving, he was healing, and he wasn't doing it alone. The day Ryan was finally cleared to leave the hospital, Shadow was the first to greet him at the door. The moment they stepped into the house, Shadow circled Ryan, tail wagging. But there was something careful about him, like he knew Ryan was still fragile. Ryan noticed it immediately, the way Shadow didn't jump on him like he normally would, the way his movements were deliberate, like he was making sure Ryan was okay. Ryan let out a soft chuckle and reached down, running a hand over the dog's fur. "You don't have to treat me like I'm gonna break, buddy." Shadow licked his fingers, his way of responding. Emily watched the exchange from the kitchen, her heart swelling. A few months ago, this would have been impossible. Ryan voluntarily petting Shadow, talking to him like he was a part of the family. Now it felt natural, like this was the way things were always meant to be. Ryan exhaled as he sat down on the couch, rubbing his temples. He was exhausted, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like himself again. "You okay?" Emily asked, walking over to sit beside him. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, just feels weird being home." Emily knew what he meant. The hospital had been their whole world for months. Now, stepping back into their normal lives, it almost felt foreign. Shadow, sensing the shift in mood, hopped up beside Ryan, resting his head on his lap. Ryan looked down at him, his fingers absently scratching behind his ears. "Guess I'm not the only one who missed home." Emily smiled softly. "No, you're definitely not." The first few days back were an adjustment. Ryan still felt weak. The exhaustion hit him in waves, and there were moments where he felt like he was floating through the day. but Shadow never left his side. Every time Ryan moved, Shadow moved with him. When he sat down, Shadow settled at his feet. When he lay down, Shadow curled up beside him. When he woke up in the middle of the night, feeling restless, Shadow was already watching him, as if he knew. Emily noticed too. One afternoon she found Ryan sitting in the backyard, staring at the sky. Shadow was lying beside him, ears perked, waiting. She could see it, the way Ryan had changed. He wasn't just grateful to Shadow, he depended on him now, in ways he never thought he would. She walked over, setting 2 cups of tea down on the table. Ryan turned to her with a small smile, but she could see the tiredness in his eyes. "How are you feeling?" she asked, sitting beside him. Ryan exhaled, leaning back. "Like I've been given a second chance." Emily's chest tightened at his words. Ryan looked down at Shadow, his fingers brushing against his fur. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for him." Shadow, as if understanding, wagged his tail. Emily smiled softly. "I think he knows that." Ryan let out a breath, something settling inside him. He had spent so much time pushing Shadow away, so much time seeing him as an obstacle, instead of what he really was, family. The wedding was approaching. It wasn't something they had talked about in months. It had been pushed aside, lost in the chaos of hospital visits, treatments, and recovery. But now, with Ryan growing stronger, it felt like something they could finally focus on again. Emily brought it up one evening, hesitantly. "We don't have to rush anything," she said, watching Ryan carefully. "But I was thinking, maybe we could start planning again." Ryan blinked at her. "The wedding?" Emily nodded, chewing on her lip. "I mean only if you're ready." Ryan was silent for a moment. Then he let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "I think we should." Emily's brows lifted in surprise. "Yeah?" Ryan reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Yeah? I don't want to waste any more time." Her heart fluttered at his words. Shadow, lying on the floor beside them, let out a low huff, stretching his paws. Ryan chuckled. "And obviously he's gonna be part of it." Emily laughed, shaking her head. "Obviously." Yep. As the days passed, they started planning. It was different this time. Not rushed, not stressful. It was something they were doing together. Ryan, surprisingly, took charge of one thing: Shadow's role. "He's walking down the aisle," he stated one evening, arms crossed. Emily grinned. "Oh, so you're planning the wedding now?" Ryan smirked. "Only the important parts." Emily rolled her eyes but leaned in, pressing a kiss to his cheek. "I love you." Ryan squeezed her waist. "I love you too." And in the corner of the room, Shadow wagged his tail, as if he already knew the best part was still coming. The morning of the wedding arrived with a crisp autumn breeze, the kind that carried the promise of something new. Emily stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the delicate lace of her dress. Her heart pounded, not from nerves, but from the overwhelming sense of finally, everything had led to this moment. The months of fear, of uncertainty, of almost losing everything. And now here she was, standing on the edge of forever, with Ryan waiting for her just outside. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the bridesmaids. Instead, her mother peeked inside with a warm smile. But she wasn't alone. Shadow trotted in first, his tail wagging as he beelined toward her. Emily let out a breathless laugh as he pressed his nose against her hand, his deep brown eyes filled with something more than excitement. Shadow wasn't just happy, he understood. Emily knelt down, taking his face in her hands. "You know today's a big day, huh?" Shadow gave her a soft lick on the cheek, then sat proudly, as if saying, "I'm ready too." Her mother chuckled, watching the exchange. "I think he's more prepared than you are." Emily let out a laugh, but something caught in her throat. Her fingers ran through Shadow's fur, her heart tightening at the thought of everything they had been through. The pain, the near loss, the fear of choosing between love and loyalty. And now here they were, together. Shadow had saved Ryan, saved all of them. Emily took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stood. "I'm ready," she whispered. Shadow wagged his tail. Outside, the ceremony had already begun. Guests were seated, soft murmurs filling the air. Ryan stood at the altar, hands clasped together, his breath steady, but his heart racing. He had never been a man who believed in fate, but standing there, watching the doors where Emily would walk through at any moment, he couldn't deny it anymore. Everything had led them here. And then, the music started. The doors opened. Ryan sucked in a breath as Emily stepped forward, radiant. Her dress flowed with every step, her eyes locked on his, and for the first time in months, everything felt right. But she wasn't alone. Shadow walked beside her, proud, his head high, his tuxedo harness sitting perfectly against his golden fur. Ryan felt his throat tighten. He had hated that dog. He had pushed him away, resented him, tried to make Emily choose, and yet, Shadow had never given up on him. Not when he ignored him, not when he had been so close to death that only Shadow's instincts had saved him. Shadow had always seen Ryan as family, and now, Ryan finally saw him the same way. Emily reached the altar, and as she placed her hand in Ryan's, she gave him a knowing smile. Ryan smirked back, then did something that surprised everyone. He knelt down, in front of all the guests, in front of Emily, in front of Shadow. He reached out and ran a firm, grateful hand through the dog's fur. "Thank you," Ryan whispered. Shadow licked his hand once, a silent understanding passing between them. Ryan stood, exhaling as he turned back to Emily. "Are you ready?" she asked softly. Ryan smiled. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life." The ceremony went by in a blur of emotion and laughter. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and when the officiant finally announced them as husband and wife, the crowd erupted in cheers. But the best moment came when they stepped off the altar. As they walked back down the aisle, Emily leaning into Ryan's side, Shadow trotted ahead like a proud guardian, tail wagging as if he knew his job wasn't over. It never would be. That evening, that reception was filled with laughter, music, and endless dancing. Ryan sat at the sweetheart table, watching as Emily twirled across the dance floor with friends, happiness radiating from her in waves. Shadow sat beside him, head resting on Ryan's knee. Ryan absently ran a hand through the dog's fur, lost in thought. "I guess we really are stuck together, huh?" he murmured. Shadow huffed, nudging his leg as if to say, "You finally figured it out." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. This dog, who had annoyed him, challenged him, saved him, had changed his life forever. And now, Ryan wouldn't have it any other way. As the night wound down, Emily and Ryan stepped out onto the balcony, looking out at the city skyline. It felt surreal. Ryan exhaled, wrapping an arm around her waist. "So what's next?" Emily hummed, leaning into him. "Actually," she trailed off, a mischievous smile curling her lips. Ryan narrowed his eyes. "What?" Emily reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and turned it toward him. Ryan's eyes widened. It was a picture of a rescued puppy, a tiny Labrador mix, ears flopped forward, big brown eyes staring up at the camera. Ryan's jaw dropped. "You didn't," Emily smirked. "He's at the shelter right now. We can pick him up after the honeymoon." Ryan groaned, running a hand down his face. "You're serious?" Emily wrapped her arms around his neck, grinning. "Come on, Shadow's gonna need an apprentice." Ryan turned to Shadow, who sat beside them, tail wagging. Ryan sighed dramatically. "You planned this, didn't you?" Shadow let out a low, amused woof. Ryan laughed, a full, genuine laugh. Then, shaking his head, he pulled Emily close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Fine," he muttered, grinning. "But if you choose my shoes, I'm blaming you." Emily giggled. As the city lights flickered behind them, Ryan watched the two most important souls in his life, his wife, and his dog, and felt something settle deep in his chest. Contentment, love, home. And just like that, their story wasn't ending. It was only just beginning. The first morning after the wedding felt like a dream. Sunlight filtered through the curtains of their new home, casting a golden hue over the room. Ryan stirred, blinking awake, only to find Shadow already sitting at the foot of the bed, watching him. Ryan let out a tired chuckle, rubbing his face. "You don't take days off, huh?" Shadow wagged his tail but didn't move. Something in his eyes seemed expectant. Ryan turned to Emily, still curled up beside him, tangled in the sheets. For the first time in months she looked peaceful. No stress, no worry, just contentment. Ryan sighed, stretching his arms. All right, buddy, I get it. Time to start the day. Shadow finally jumped down, heading toward the door. But the moment Ryan's feet hit the floor, the doorbell rang. His brows furrowed. Who would be here this early? Emily groaned, stirring. What's that? Not sure. Ryan slipped on a t-shirt. I'll check. Shadow was already at the door, ears perked, body stiff. A slow unease crawled up Ryan's spine as he stepped forward and peered through the peephole. A man stood there, dark jeans, a leather jacket, unfamiliar. But something about him set off every alarm in Ryan's head. His instincts, honed from years of emergencies, of knowing when something wasn't right, flared to life. Ryan didn't open the door. Instead, he cleared his throat and spoke through it. Can I help you? The man didn't blink. Ryan Miller? Ryan's jaw clenched. Who's asking? The man exhaled, smirking slightly. Calloway says hello. Ryan's blood ran cold. Calloway. The name slammed into him like a freight train. He thought it was over. Thought the nightmare had ended when he testified. When Shadow saved him. When they finally got their happy ending. But now, someone was standing on his doorstep, bringing the past back to haunt him. Ryan didn't hesitate. He locked the deadbolt, stepped back quickly. His pulse thundered in his ears as he turned to Shadow, who was already growling low, his body tense, ready to strike. Emily was sitting up now, sensing his urgency. Ryan. He turned to her, forcing his voice to stay calm. Call the cops. Emily's eyes widened. What? Ryan swallowed. Call them. Now. He's Ed. The minutes stretched long. The man stayed outside, never leaving the doorstep. Ryan peeked out again, only to find him smirking, like he knew something Ryan didn't. Then just as sirens blared in the distance, the man stepped back. He tilted his head, eyes flicking to Ryan one last time before saying, "See you soon." Then he walked away. Ryan didn't relax, not even when the cops arrived, not even when he gave his statement, because deep down, he knew the truth. This wasn't over. Ryan drove home late that night, knuckles tight on the wheel. His shift at the hospital had been long, exhausting, but his mind had never been further from work. The man's words haunted him. See you soon. Ryan had faced death before. He had worked on people with seconds left to live. He had been in fires, accidents, situations where every moment counted. But this was different. Because this time, it wasn't just him. Emily, Shadow. They were in danger too. He turned onto his street, and his stomach dropped. A car was parked right outside his house. A dark-colored SUV. Running, no one got out. No one went in. It just sat there. Ryan didn't go home. Instead, he drove past, pulled into a neighbor's driveway 2 houses down, cut the engine, and waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes. The SUV didn't move. Who were they waiting for? Him? Emily? Then his phone buzzed. Emily. He answered instantly. Hey, you okay? Her voice was tense. Ryan, I think someone's outside. His heart stopped. Where's Shadow? Right here, growling at the door. What's going on? Ryan swallowed hard. Stay inside. Lock everything. Do not open the door. I'm coming. One trust. Ryan reached the front yard in seconds. Shadow was barking behind the door. Deep, sharp warning barks. Not normal, not friendly. Ryan turned. The SUV was still there. The moment he faced it, the engine roared to life. Tires screeched. And then it sped off. Ryan stood frozen, breath coming too fast. They had been watching. They had been waiting. Inside, Emily was pale. Ryan locked the door behind him, then pulled her into his arms. It's him, isn't it? She whispered against his chest. Ryan closed his eyes. I don't know, but he did. They all did. Shadow nudged his leg, as if to say, I told you. Then, the lights went out. Ryan froze. The entire house plunged into pitch black. The quiet hum of electricity, the refrigerator, the street lamps outside, gone. Emily gasped. Ryan, stay with me, he ordered. Shadow let out a deep, rumbling growl. Ryan pulled out his phone. No signal. Then, through the window, headlights. Someone was pulling up. Ryan grabbed Emily's wrist. Upstairs. Now. They didn't argue. Didn't hesitate. They ran. Shadow was right beside them. The next few minutes stretched like hours. Ryan held his breath at the top of the stairs, listening. Footsteps. Outside. Then a knock. Slow. Purposeful. Ryan's entire body tightened. 1,000 possibilities raced through his mind. Then a voice. Ryan Miller. Ryan's blood turned to ice. Emily gripped his arm. Shadow bristled as he let out a deep, throaty snarl. Then glass shattered downstairs. Emily flinched. Shadow bolted. Ryan's heart slammed into his ribs. Shadow, no. Too late. Shadow launched himself into the darkness. Ryan had no choice. He followed. The final fight. The front window smashed. A man inside, holding something. Ryan wasn't fast enough. Shadow was already there. Then a gunshot. Ryan saw red. Shadow collapsed. Emily screamed. Ryan lunged. The fight was brutal, but Ryan didn't stop. When the cops burst through the door, Ryan was still pummeling the man. Shadow was bleeding. Emily was crying. But they were alive. The Shadow survived. The vet called it a miracle. Ryan sat by his side every day. You never gave up, Ryan whispered, stroking his fur. Shadow blinked up at him. Ryan smiled. He understood now. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was family.